Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. I played on the PS5, it's also available on the PS4, Xbox One, Xbox Series, and PC. Okay, so let's get into the story. You play as Star-Lord of the Guardians of the Galaxy, and they've been together for a while, but not an insanely long time at this point. It's very obvious that some of them have been members of the team longer than others, and they do a good job portraying that. But this being the Guardians of the Galaxy, they have a job, they screw up the job, and then they try and unscrew up the job, and then it winds up turning into something much bigger than it was originally going to be. I mean, that is basically how the stories work, at least in the movies. I've never really read the comics, but it definitely follows that kind of pattern, and I gotta say, I actually really like the story in this game. I think it's an incredibly well-written game. I really love the dialogue. I think they did a great job with that. And I think they did an awesome job of making these characters their own. They don't feel like carbon copies of the comic book versions or previous video game versions. They feel like their own versions. And I think they did a really cool job just kind of breathing life into the ship, not just from a visual standpoint, but it will bleed into the visuals, obviously, because they did script some things. But they did a good job with it because there's a point where there's a space llama, yes, a space llama, and that space llama chews up the comms array in the ship, and so you've got Rocket running back and forth between his room where he keeps all of his tools and stuff and the comms room to fix it. So you can wander around the ship, and while you're doing that, he'll be running back and forth. And so things like that are well-written details that just breathe life into the world. But beyond that, like I said, I actually really enjoyed the story. I liked the story they told. I think they did a great job telling it. And it really is that simple for me when it comes to the story. Now let's get into the audio. And the first thing I'm going to say is I love the soundtrack. Whether it's the licensed music or the original score for the game, I just think they did a great job. It emphasizes the moments it needs to emphasize. The music just kind of gives it its own life, but it also grounds it in what, fans do know from Guardians of the Galaxy based on the movie. As for the voiceover work, I think they did a really good job there as well. I think every person cast just brings such character to, their characters, that it really matters, and it does help give you a better sense of these characters. But again, they've taken what we're familiar with and kind of made it their own, and I like that. Then there's the sound effects, which I think the sound effects are very well done in this game. I mean, really, to put it very simply, all the audio in this game is very well done if it weren't for the glitches. I unfortunately ran into a lot of audio glitches. And unfortunately, the only way around those was to exit out to the main menu or even close the game entirely and go back in. As well as certain audio things that aren't even glitches, but they are still issues nonetheless. So first off, there were times where a character, and just one character, and it would be at random, where their dialogue would disappear, both from an audio standpoint and a subtitles standpoint. Great example was Groot made a comment, or I actually spoke to Groot, and then he said something to which other characters started laughing about because he apparently said something funny, and then they would say something to him and he'd say something back, except for the part where he didn't say anything back. He had no dialogue in that version. So when I reloaded, fortunately it loaded me before that, so I did get to hear the whole conversation eventually. But otherwise it just sounded like characters responding to nothing, and it happened with multiple characters on several occasions. But not only that, this game has too much dialogue, which sounds insane, and it really isn't a negative. The negative is that there are times where somebody will start a conversation, but because you're moving forward, another conversation will start, and that previous conversation will get cut off, and you won't get to hear the whole thing. And it's really obnoxious because, honestly, I think the dialogue is so well written that I want to hear those entire conversations. So eventually it got to a point where I would just stop playing the game so I could hear the conversation and then start again. And then another conversation would start and I would stop playing, basically, and listen. So it got very frustrating in some ways because I couldn't keep playing because I wanted to hear the conversations, and if I wanted to hear them, I couldn't continue playing or else they were going to get cut off by some bullshit. Okay, now let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, and this is a third-person action game where you have a squad that you can control with some very, very, very minor RPG elements. The The RPG elements are basically limited to you getting what are called ability points and, giving your characters new abilities that they can use in combat, that you can trigger in combat, etc. It doesn't seem to really affect their health, their shields, their damage, or any of those things. But it is basically a lot of exploring and a lot of combat, and the combat is actually really fulfilling. Star-Lord can use both melee and ranged attacks. You can upgrade some of his gear to make him basically more powerful, have more health, have more shield. But you do that through things that you find and collect throughout the game. But the combat goes deeper than that, in that while you are in combat, you can command your other characters to do certain things, but on their own, they are very useful and they do attack. It's not one of those games where you have other party members and they're really not doing anything. In this case, Gamora, Drax, Rocket, and Groot, they are all attacking enemies and they can defeat enemies on their own. But using their special abilities is really beneficial, and as it goes, you find out how to use them better. My only real complaint with the combat is that Star-Lord can lock on, and the lock on is really inconsistent. There are times where you'd be locked on and all of a sudden you'd lose lock on, but it seemed like for no reason. Sometimes it would stay locked on, whether they dodged or whether you got hit. Other times you'd lose it for those reasons, or it seemed for those reasons. Just no consistency, and it got really frustrating. This game also has a decent amount of platforming and platforming style puzzles, so nothing crazy, but figuring out how to get into this area, how to get to the next area, etc. Platforming isn't crazy in depth, but it's good and it is functional. I also like that you can choose dialogue options at times. I like the way it's done, and I like the way those dialogue options are both written and how they play out. I know I specifically complained about it in my Guardians of the Galaxy Telltale version, but some of the dialogue was so shit and it just didn't make sense, and it's nothing that any human would ever say or any person would ever say, and it would affect the gameplay, whereas in this, it did kind of affect certain things that happen throughout the game, but it's done intelligently, and it's done in a way that fits the character, and it's done in a way that you're sitting there going, yeah, I would have responded like that. So I gotta say, I really like the gameplay. I do think there are a few small issues. Also, there's a New Game Plus mode, which I always love. I always appreciate that. Now let's get into the controls, and overall I think the controls work well. I do think there are some things that could be done better, but as for moving and general responsiveness of the controls as well as aiming, I can't say that I had any real complaints. There are QuickTime events in the game, and your controls respond very well. When you're shooting, your controls work well for the most part. My only real complaint with combat is you hold down, or at least I held down in this situation, the L1 button, and then you would get a little menu so that you could do, Gamora's or Drax's or any of the team members' special abilities. I wish that you could just hold down the L1 button, use one person's, and then it would take you back to the main menu of that, and you could use somebody else's. Instead, you have to then press L1 again, do the next person. Press L1 again, do the next person. I just think they could have streamlined that a little bit better, but overall it still works well. Then lastly, the graphics and visuals. And as I've already said, this game does a really good job taking what we know, the most mainstream version of the Guardians of the Galaxy, which would be the movies, and then making it their own. None of these characters are so far removed from what you've seen previously that you wouldn't recognize them, but they are made in their own style. So, like I said, they took it and made it their own, and I like that. I like what they did, the small tweaks they did with each of the characters. I also like that you can find a bunch of different outfits for the characters. I thought that was fun. And I love the design of all the different worlds. I love their version of Nowhere. I love just all the different worlds. Like I said, they all have their own element, and they did such a great job bringing it to life. And that's true of all the side characters, all the enemies. They took them and made their own version of the Guardians of the Galaxy universe, and quite frankly, I love it, and I want to see more of it. I love that it's bright and colorful. I love how they use the visuals to help tell the story, obviously, and how they did the animations and how they bothered to do the small things like having Rocket run from room to room when he needs to repair things, having Groot watering plants at one point. I just think they did a good job with all of that. They also did a good job making it look cartoony, but not overly cartoony. They land on a good medium between like cartoony, comic bookish, and still sort of realistic. But I think they did a great job with that. However, I did run into a few visual glitches once again. You know, having those outfits, but then they would disappear in certain cutscenes, and then I would be in a completely different costume when I would start a level. Or how at one point I was talking to Gamora and she was sharpening her sword and then it disappeared and then flew back to her across the screen. Or how Peter was supposed to touch some goo on the ground and there was no goo on the ground. Or in a way that did affect combat was I started a fight right after a save and I didn't have Peter's blaster charge meters on my screen like I should have had, because his blasters kind of overheat and then you can do like this discharge attack that's kind of like a quick reload as well. But if I can't see the meters, I can't perform the move, and so I had to quit out the game and quit back in, just like I did with the audio issues. So as much as I love the visual style, there are some visual glitches that they do need to sort out. But otherwise, I do like what they built from a visual standpoint. So to wrap this up, I really enjoyed this game overall. I do think it is a good game, but it needs some patching because there are enough small things and they happen frequently enough that it starts to chip away at the overall quality of this game. None of them are bad enough to say that the game is shit. None of them are so bad that I can sit there and go, ugh, it just ruined the experience. They do take you out of the experience just a little bit, and it does get frustrating having to quit out and get back in. Now, I don't know if this happens across all versions of the game, but it definitely happened on the PS5 version, and it was frustrating. That being said, I do think the experience is worth it. I do recommend the game. I will say, however, just be prepared for some minor frustrations. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, how was your Halloween? I'm recording this like right before Halloween actually, but it'll come out after Halloween, so... And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one.